Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. For those of you who may not have seen my face before, I've been with OTTRS, the Organizational Teams and Technology Research Society here at UMD for a little over a year now. I am the speaker series coordinator for OTTRS. And it is my pleasure to introduce you today to Daniel Nguyen. I was reaching out to people in my network at the beginning of this year to find speakers, and we have a mutual contact who was at Florida Tech, and I met at Society for Human Resource Management, and she connected me with Daniel, and turns out his topic is absolutely perfect for this group. Without further ado, I'll throw it over to you, Daniel. Welcome and love to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate the intro, Josh. And yeah, thank you guys for having me here. It's always exciting to hear about people who are doing research in the same vicinity and proximity and just share and talk about this, have dialogue about what we're doing, what's going on in the space. So thank you again for having me. I'm super excited to see what you guys have to say and just having conversations about this topic. So let me go ahead and get started here. I have 40 minutes, is that right? Until 12:40, and then after that's Q&A time? All right, cool. I'll make sure I pace myself. So quick overview on the whole, because this title slide I'm realizing is a little bit niche down for a title. The general gist of what I'm here to talk to you guys about is a research endeavor that I've been a part of for the past 2 years. And so it is a grant-funded effort that studies human agent teaming. And so before that, just to give myself a bit of a background on who I am and where I'm coming from, the people I work with, my collaborators here. So my name is Daniel Nguyen. I just recently graduated with my Ph.D. in industrial organizational psychology from Florida Tech. And during my time there, I've mostly focused within IO psychology on teams in particular, and my niche sub areas of interest in particular were anything in terms of team methodology. So think more about multi-level modeling, everything like that, aggregation. And then topic wise, I really fell in love with the idea of human agent teaming is what I was introduced to at the time. So my second year, when I was working my thesis, I was still a little bit new to the team space. I kind of knew that I just generally studying how people work together. And then my advisor, Dr. Jessica Wildman, had randomly thrown the idea out, hey, there's this new idea that people are buzzing about where humans and machines are working together. Sounds like something up your alley. And so I was all right, cool. Here we are. And so my advisor and I are coming from a applied center at Florida Tech called the Institute for Cultural Collaboration and Management. And broadly speaking, we just study the ways that contextual and organizational factors influence the way we work, and vice versa, how teams and teams of teams ultimately influence the way that work is done in an organization, the culture around that. And so that's that side. And then relatedly, down that tangent towards the last couple of years here, I also started joining a human factors lab there through some connections that I had. So we both had a shared interest in human performance at large. And so that's what you see on the right side, the Atlas lab. That's led by Dr. Meredith Carroll. And so she focuses a lot more on studying pilots and human performance and training in that space. So how do we actually prepare them and focus on pilot readiness? But as part of that too, there's a lot more of the unmanned aerial vehicle space. And so the connection that we kind of eventually joined for is exactly this topic here, the human agent teaming. So how are we having people work together in that? And so this is our full list here. Our 3 PIs are Dr. Meredith Carroll from the Atlas Lab. So she studies aviation human factors. And then my advisor, Dr. Jessica Wildman, and then another faculty member, Dr. Amanda Thayer. So as you can see here, we're a mix of human factors and IO psychology to make a multidisciplinary team, so that we can kind of get both the understanding of the human side and then the agent side with this when we're talking about this whole teaming process. So relatively, let's quickly talk about the problem space and where we're coming from, and give you guys an understanding of the project and what I've been working on for the past couple of years. So first things first, I'm sure you guys are fairly familiar with the broad concept, but just to lay some groundwork about what human agent teaming is in particular. As we all know, we're kind of in that fourth industrial revolution era where AI, smart technology is all the buzz right now. The idea is coming a lot more that instead of like being like tools that we use, like calculators and just like machinery and automation, these intelligent systems are becoming more teammates. The way we interact with them, the facsimile is much more to the paradigm of teaming, right? And so to kind of put that into perspective, or like lay out explicitly, a recent criteria or definition that was laid out by O'Neill and colleagues in the literature says that human agent teaming specifically is whenever you have at least one human and one autonomous agent. And that autonomous piece is important because that idea is it's the machine that can act and like make its own decisions without having to be controlled. So I don't have to tell it, go do this and then give me this. It's, it has its own programming, its own scripts, and it's moving and reacting to the task environment on its own. And they have distinct roles. So they're not necessarily doing the same thing, but like there's a reason that we're teaming with an agent because it has special capabilities, and then vice versa. We have our own special roles. The tasking is interdependent, just like in traditional teams. So the things that we do move are, we depend on one another. So whatever the agent does needs a little bit of my input and vice versa. And then of course, it's all towards the same shared goals. We have the same mission, like our tasks are moving to get the same objectives completed. So that's the nutshell. And so a lot of the spaces that I've been studying or that I've been hearing about with this topic are like, for example, in the military, a lot of drones, right? So unmanned aerial vehicles and how you have like one operator working with like 3 or 4 UAVs to do like a reconnaissance mission. Search and rescue is a big one too, especially using machines to get into areas that are dangerous for humans. So navigating through those like collapsed buildings, through those unsafe terrains, through fires and stuff like that to identify and remove obstacles, or even just in like manufacturing, for example. On the right side here, you can see it's become a much more commonplace thing to have like an intelligent arm that knows what like the welder or like the mechanic needs next, and then kind of puts things into position so that they can do their job. So all that being said, our project and our grant is funded by the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, AFOSR. And the whole idea was to start understanding more about what trust in human agent teams specifically look like. So we've all, of course, had experiences working with people. We know how important like trust is and integral to relationships and effectively navigating them. And now that we're moving towards this paradigm where agents are seen as teammates, same concept, like how much we trust the agents is really important to the way like we work with them, to the eventual like, downstream outcomes like performance and longevity and cohesion of the team. And so we were really interested in studying trust, but more specifically, we had 2 kind of major objectives in mind with this. We kind of saw this gap in the literature, or literatures, I should say, with this, where trust and automation research historically is, again, it looks at it more as like, how does one human work on like this one, machine, like basically super calculator, and just feeding it, and like it's more like the UX UI kind of side to it, but also that's dyadic, right? It's just like one human and like one machine. And so what we were really thinking about is like the teams component here is with teams with an S at the end. What happens when you have more than one agent, or you have like a single person or multiple agent like teams. And so we wanted to understand what trust looks like in that scenario. So do the same principles, or how similar do like principles of like networks and teams apply to these phenomenon, right? So if I'm working in a party of 3 or 4, it's different than a party of 1 in the sense that like there's subgrouping, there's different dynamics in terms of like spillover, for example, like if one person does something wrong, like it can affect my trust towards the whole team, things of that nature. So we're really interested in understanding how that works with human agent teaming in particular. And then on top of that, we were also really interested in how we measure that more effectively, because those examples I gave you, it'd be very unfeasible, very unethical to stop a firefighter in the middle of the this task and be like, hey, take the survey so I know how much you trust your agent while he's trying to save lives. And so we were also thinking about, in terms of practicality and downstream applications, how can we infer these like indicators of trust more accurately, especially at that team level like we're talking about. So that's the gist of the grant. It's a 3-year effort. So our first year was focused on theory building. So we just did lots and lots of fun literature reviews, both on like the trust perspective and also on like the measurements of trust in human agent teams. And then we came up with 2 frameworks, one for each. We kind of thought through the theories I would apply, made like a model for it, and then for both the concepts behind human agent teaming at the team level, like trust there, and then also what like potentially like a measurement suite, including less obtrusive measures might look like. Our second year, we focused on dividing out and focusing on like trust violations specifically. And so if we manipulated characteristics of trust violations, what would happen, and studying how trust again moves at that team level. there, and then also starting to validate a little bit of like the unobtrusive measure framework. And then year 3, which is currently ongoing right now, is focus on the trust repair part. So I'll have to say, like, our ultimate goal here is to validate like these frameworks and say like there's evidence that like these theories about trust at the team level for human agent teaming actually is the case. So, and you can measure it with, this application. So get right into it. So for the first year, like I mentioned, we just focused on the framework. How do we actually model and think about the way that these human agent teams are interacting on multiple levels? And then also, how are we going to measure that? Or what are the ways that we can actually tap into that and infer it without just surveying all the time? And so first things first, in terms of the literature, of course, we needed to think about like what has been done already and where the strengths and the gaps are in the literature. And so the 3 main kind of things we had found so far in terms of trust. So the first thing is that there's a very, very heavy emphasis on trust dynamics. So there's plenty of research that focus specifically on trust and how it gets violated. So what are the characteristics and what are the things that cause one to lose trust more or less? So things like if it's an integrity-based violation, competency-based violation, the severity of it, the outcomes, things like that. And then of course, accordingly, like how can you intervene and repair that trust once it's been lost? So plenty of literature has looked at all these different strategies at different levels, both on like the violators and in the violetees ends, about characteristics that you can imbue the agents with, strategies that you can have the agents like say in order to try and repair trust. And then also calibration, the idea that like trust is sometimes talked about like it's just a good thing on the whole, but in this space, especially with agents, it's a little bit different from humans in that like you don't want to over trust, because at that point you get complacent, you just let them kind of do whatever and you're no longer effectively teaming with them. So that's been a huge part of like what we've seen in the literature there, which is really good. That's a very strong starting point for us. And then in terms of the parties though, like the relationships themselves, it's very largely dyadic. There are a few studies that aggregate to the team level, but they usually default to just like averaging it. So they just take these scores and they just say, give me the mean, that's the team level trust. And so, and also related to that, a lot of the teaming part is a lot more automation based. So this whole like field of literature dates back like well into like the 1900s and like the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of that isn't really like teaming yet. So some of the studies, when they call it a human agent team, you don't actually observe characteristics of teaming, like interdependencies and roles and everything like that. So all that to say, our theory and our framework wanted to move towards answering the next level of that. So 3 main things we wanted to address: the multi-level idea. So it's so focused on like this dyadic level, just like one agent, one human. But we just wanted to know what happens if you had multiple humans. How does one person think about multiple different types of agents in their team? And then we also wanted to start thinking about like the dynamics part of it. And so yeah, people are studying like what happens after this, and like there is research on like the trajectories, but we also wanted to think about like the idea that these are events, right? Whenever someone like violates their trust, they did something that made me lose it. And so there are characteristics about that event that we need to be considering that will interplay into all of this. And then the last part, again, focusing on the teaming here, because trust is known as being an emergent state in the team's literature, which means that it unfolds and it is built over time based on the way that we interact with them, right? So like trust like can be influenced initially by a lot of like factors, but really what happens is after we work together and I start understanding the way you work, you understand the way I work, we slowly like start like adjusting and building that trust differently. So we wanted to understand the emergent piece of it, and that can only happen if they're actually teammates, right? So it's not just one directional interactions. All that to say, this is the resulting theory, and it looks like a lot of boxes and crazy arrows, but it really boils down to 3 main things that I just mentioned. So the first one, like we said, is it's multi-level. Here we wanted to focus on understanding what happens at each level. And so it's kind of based on like the IMOI concept, the input mediator output input idea, that talks about how like there are certain things that kickstart, that like resources that will, jumpstart the entire process. Things will happen, to convert it, and then you'll get outcomes. But so we acknowledge all the inputs that we found in the literature here. But really importantly, what we really wanted to focus on is the idea of how they move between the levels, right? And so that was one area where we talked about trust. And when we looked in the literature, especially for the human agent teaming stuff, they don't have as much fundamental like teams methodology, right? In terms of the multi-level like assessment and like conceptualization behind it. And we kind of did say like we is it just like an average? We don't necessarily think so. And especially when you only have one human trusting multiple agents, it's not the same thing as when you're like, tapping into like multiple humans trusting. And so there could be very much differences in the way we think about that. And so that one of the main ideas, from the team's literature for multi-level theory is that whenever, these states emerge, like trust, for example, it may not necessarily be like uniform and that it just kind of all like nicely, neatly piles up. It may be like this complex network where it's like I might trust one person a little bit more, and because of that, I might not trust this one person, or like vice versa. Like if one other person or one type of agent in this case builds up a lot of trust, it may be the case that I trust another similar agent more because of that. And so we just believe that it's possible for it to span on different continuums here. So it could be shared in some cases, but it may also be like asymmetrical in some cases that if you have multiple agents. And so that was one area that in our framework, we just wanted to acknowledge and really put that out there in the literature to say this multi-level like thought here when you're having multiple agents in the team, it may not necessarily just be like an average. Like we should be thinking about the discontinuous, like the non just average ways that it can emerge, right? So trust may not just be this like unanimous, like aggregated like ball at the top. It may be this bigger complex network of trust. So that was the main call out that we wanted to care about, but we also did again want to incorporate the time elements. You'll notice like the horizontal pieces here, and you'll notice like the very bottom we put those characteristics here, these events. And so we wanted to play off of event systems theory to really talk about the fact that events have a certain strength and like a novelty, these types of characteristics that will actually propagate like through the system in different ways. So those events may affect the subgroup more. It may only affect like one dyadic relationship, or it might affect the entire team in different ways. And so we just basically wanted to throw that in there, all this entire model to say it doesn't necessarily just emerge neatly over time. And whenever things happen within like certain dyads and relationships, it can trickle across and like affect the team differently on the whole. So just to kind of illustrate that point here, if you think about like our idea is that like this trust might be like a rubber band where like if you are pulling on certain aspects of it, other pieces might get more taut or more loose from it. But that whole team trust is not necessarily like uniform. It may be that it moves in different ways and it's constantly morphing over time based on like the way you have these different relationships. So speaking to the unobtrusive measurement piece of everything, we also of course wanted to tap into indicators and understanding what are the ways that this trust in agents can be actually measured in the literature. And so of course you have validated scales that we've seen, there's plenty of those, but there's also a lot of other ways that we've observed that can be studied in the literature. For example, single items are very popular for longitudinal studies. Whenever you're studying something, you want like more frequent intervals, you can have a very quick pop-up sometimes in simulation and just say real quick, 1 to 10, how much do you trust them? They'll click 7, then moves on. And then that way you can more quickly and less disruptively add it. But then two other categories that we've kind of found are first behavioral measures. So these are of course just literally things that are observable that people do. You can watch it. So the first little subsection we call is usage behavior. And so there's a taxonomy in this in the literature, but the gist is just like, am I actually using it properly? Am I like not using it whatsoever? Like I'm just completely ignoring it. Am I abusing it? So for example, I'm like tinkering it and using it in ways that it's not supposed to be, or am I like misusing it, or over relying on it? So there's different like continuums and like of that category there. So that, but that all has to say about like how am I actually choosing to like interact with and use it. And then there's also like this category and bucket of like context specific actions where like it's not a generalizable indicator of trust, but for this particular instance, it makes a lot of sense. So for example, if you're using like I think what some of the studies do like a banking or like a finance type game, one trust move might be like, I'm trusting you to take like, I'm going to put $500 in your account. I'm trusting you to invest it properly on our behalf type situation where it's like that transference of money is like a trust indication that only makes sense in that particular one. So that's like the behavioral suite. And then on the physiological side, these are more of like, your actual body's rhythm and like what's happening internally. And so there's a whole suite of those and everything ranging from like eye tracking, vocal inflection, all this type of stuff here. And what we did in one of our papers in this first year is after we did like an entire review, we basically started scanning and finding like what are the strongest indicators from each of these categories here, like across the literature. And these 6 that you see nested underneath that on that second row right there, those are the ones that we had found the most support for in the literature. So validated scales, of course, are used regularly. Single item scales used a lot. People use like that use paradigm a lot. People very often used context-specific actions. And then the cardiovascular and like the galvanic skin response, which is basically just how much you're sweating. It's essentially just how much skin activity you have there. Those are the ones that were the most correlated to trust, we found. And so we pulled that out, and then vertically, these are different types of metrics in terms of like the usefulness or like the pros of each one here. And so all these pluses are basically just us saying like, these are some of the strengths for it. But without getting too much in the weeds, that's kind of like our overall framework to say, here are all the measures that have been done in the literature, here are their strengths. Now, how do we adapt that and start thinking about recommendations we can offer to help people do that? And for ourselves, how are we going to do this? And what we decided to do is do this on like a use case basis here. And so effectively speaking, there's this continuum that you can think of in terms of this interaction, this teaming piece. So when I'm teaming with my teammate, how much am I actually interacting with them? Relatedly, how much do I expect trust to change? So in some cases, for example, like round-based games, like there's only 2 or 3 like rounds like in an experiment, it's very low interactivity in that like you only like are doing, you might only be doing like 1 or 2 little actions, like just literally like placing like a red something on their circle, or just a quick little round-based task. And it only happens a couple of times. You're only expecting like a couple little blips of changes in trust, right? Versus on the opposite end of the spectrum, like these search and rescue missions, or like these video game simulations, or like all these very like dynamic, quick pace, like they're like constantly moving and thinking, like you don't really have that time. So you're expecting constant interactions, right? Like you're regularly, very quickly, like, you know, working with that agent. And so you also expect trust to actually oscillate a lot more because of that too. And so that's kind of the continuum we set here. And so effectively what we then did is took those 6 and said, these are the ones that make the most sense across the use cases. So for example, it doesn't make a lot of sense here to be using like physiological data if you're just going to do like round-based games, because then you can just survey after the rounds, right? That's a lot of cost there. You don't need that level of granularity. But if you were to do something very rapid and interactive, you do need that granularity to understand like where are the exact moments where the trust might be dipping, where are the exact changes happening, and like what is it in reaction to. So this was our measurement effort. And so those are the 2 results of our first year, that theoretical framework and then that measurement framework here. And then in our second year, we dialed into like trust violation. So like I mentioned with the characteristics there on like the theoretical framework, we have the trust violation and the trust repair. So our first step was to understand just with trust violation, what are the characteristics that happen? How does this look like at the team level? Or what does this look like at the team level? So major research questions we had here. So in a multi-agent human agent team here, so you're 1 human and multiple agents, what are the factors behind a trust violation that might actually affect trust at the team in different ways at the team level? And that team level might be like, you know, different sub teams or different like of any kind, different little dyadic relationships. And so the specific factors we wanted to test, because these are some of the ones that we've seen in the literature already that we felt would be prudent to like basically replicate, but just at the team level, were the number of agents that violate. So if you have just only 1 agent violating, just 2 agents violating, right? The timing of the violation. So if it happens like early on versus like later on during like their time working together, which one's worse for it? The spacing of those violations if there's more than 1. So if you have a double whammy like back to back versus like one happens at the beginning, one happens at the end, how does that affect overall trust? And then also accordingly playing to the team piece, how does like the characteristics or basically who is violating affect trust at the team level? So if I have 2 of like the same sub team or the 2 of the same type of agents on the team and they both violate, is that worse than like if I have 2 different types violating? And so what, in terms of like the characteristics and like the pattern of who's doing the violation, that was another area we're interested. So those are the 4 kind of main manipulations. Now, as you can imagine, if each of these have 2 to 3 levels, that can be a very, very crazy conditional paradigm, but we simplified it into 9 conditions. But before I get into that, I wanted to share like the test bed that we use and just talk a bit more about like the actual tasking and the paradigm that we're using here. And so we're doing a search and rescue mission with them, in which we have 1 human participant working with 4 agent teammates here. And these agent teammates are 2 aerial drones here, represented by this little icon right here. They're called Falcon and Eagle in the game, where these drones are responsible for like flying above these buildings and like scanning rooftops and flying through windows of locked buildings. And then we have 2 ground vehicles that are responsible for clearing rubble. So this will be rubble around like some of these buildings that only the ground robots can clear those. And so the way we have it set up is that we have like 3 little maps in the lines of in the game. You have one of each of these types of drones on either side of the human, and the humans kind of just wandering through the middle of the map by themselves. And so there's a little bit of like a suspension of disbelief where you have to just visualize that like they're coming over to you. So we have little like cuts, like black screen cuts, where you just say pretend that they're coming over to you. So, but that's the gist of it. And the goal is to identify hostile enemies that are still in the area. So this setting is like a war-torn town. So a combat just happened here, and you're here to rescue people, civilians. So rescuing civilians, identifying remaining hostiles, and then defusing any remaining explosives in the area. So you work with your teammates, you have unique roles. So only the human can defuse the IEDs, the remaining explosives. And you have to, the agents will call you, and then you call the agents accordingly based on what you need here. And so that's kind of the overall tasking paradigm, the interactions that are happening. And this lasts for a whole hour here. And so back to the conditions. Now, what we basically did for that whole 1 hour thing is we manipulated those 4 conditions in a bit of a cross-sectional pattern. So we don't have exactly every perfect interaction between all the 4 manipulations and all their levels, but between these 9, we were able to capture the majority of them. There are a couple of little like methodological constraints for some of the research questions that we'll have based on this, but this was the most feasible way to test that instead of having like a 36-something or 30-something condition experiment, which would have been impossible. So to get into that, the manipulations we had here. So to manipulate the number of violations, we had 1 violation versus 2 violations. So you can see that here. They both happen in the middle for this one. So in condition 2, you have one of the agents violating just before the 30-minute mark in the middle. And then in the 2 violation condition, you have both of them violating around the middle as well. In terms of the timing of the violation here, we had 1 violate early on in the mission, so just 10 minutes in, 1 about 30 minutes in the middle of the mission, and then 1 towards the end, 50 minutes in. And then in terms of the spacing, so how far apart they were, we had 1 that was right back to back, so this was within 5 minutes of each other. We had 1 condition that was medium, so about 20 minutes apart, and then 1 that was late or large spacing, so about like 40 minutes apart. And this is what I was saying earlier, this is a bit of a confound for this one because this is happening in the middle as opposed to ideally this happening at 10 and 20 minutes. But again, for the constraint of feasibility and logistics, we had to short that into these conditions here. And that doing this condition would allow us to study the last question, the pattern of the agents who violated. So here, like we said, we have 4 different agents. We consistently made this first ground vehicle, this pink one, always violate, and then we manipulated who violated the second time. So was it the other ground vehicle, this yellow one? Was it the one on the same team as it here? So the pink one's teammate, the drone teammate, the green one here, or is it the one on like a completely different team, orthogonal team here, where you had different agent on a different team? So in terms of measurement, we like it from that measurement framework I told you about earlier. We did each of the 3 categories there. So in the terms of the surveys and like self-report stuff, we did single item. So this is the example of the single item up in this corner here. Just very quickly, 1 to 5, rate each of your agent teammates on how much you trust them and the team as a whole. And then we also did a full trust and distrust scale that was validated. And so this happened 3 times. And so in terms of the reason we picked these ones, this single item one would allow us to do a survey every 10 minutes and give us 7 time points in total. And then this one, we got 3 time points overall. We did at the beginning in their pre-survey when they did the overall demographics and individual differences. And then 1 in the middle survey, which is a longer survey, 30 minutes in, usually after a violation, and then the team as a whole as well, and the 1 in post. In terms of behaviors, we had 2. So we did the usage one in general based on like, are they accepting, rejecting, everything like that. But on top of that, some of the context specific ones that we were able to do in this specific study here were the amount of times they pulled up like their stat screen. So the player can always check how well each of their agent teammates are doing. So one of the indicators we use is like the more they're clicking on a certain like agent might indicate that they don't trust them. They are trying to pay more attention to how well they're doing, like they're more suspicious of them or they're not as confident in their abilities. And then we also added this function called nudging. So you could tell them to search either faster, so just do more, you're not doing enough, or be more careful. So like slow down, like be more intentional. So, and that was kind of the idea, like to after a trust violation occurs, how they actually react to it, gives them an opportunity there. So, and in terms of the physiological data, we used two. So this whole sensor suite that we have right here allows us to capture heart rate, which is the electrocardiogram data right there. So literally like what is their heart voltage activity. And then also like their sweat response. So like these little nodes on their finger here and on their right there measure like their skin conductance effectively. So, and this is kind of what the output looks like or what it tracks like in real time while the simulation's happening. So quick overview here. This is all like the training and like the equipment stuff. And then once it starts, they take a survey for 1 hour, they're playing this mission. And then depending on the condition, violations happen somewhere within this like 10 to 50 minute time span. And then you have surveys every 10 minutes. So the ones at 10, 20, 40, and 50 are just single items, and the one at 30 minutes, the longer one. So quick on the participants, we had 185 total that we recruited out in Florida Tech's campus. Our average age was like 23, and like this ends up splitting to about 20, 21 participants per condition, which is not ideal. We wanted at least 30, but just due to like time constraints, you know, resource constraints, that's all we could do. So now for the fun part, the results. So in terms of the number of violations, something that interesting that we found was that trust actually naturally recovers after one violation, like right here that you can see, but not after two. So if you look at these little lines right here, this is the one where only one violation happened 30 minutes in. And you can see that after like that, it bounces down initially, it like gradually dips back up. But then when it happened twice, so it was the same agent that did it twice this time, it dips the first time, it dips the second time, and then it actually fails to recover. It just roughly flat lines around there. And then in terms of the timing of the violations, what we found was the later, there's a name for this effect and it's escaping me, I should have written this down, but there's a recent discussion or theory that says like basically the bigger they are, the harder they fall type situation. So the more trust that they gain over time, when a trust like violation happens, the worse it's going to be. And so as you can see here, like the dip's not that bad, it gets worse and it gets really bad when it gets later. So later violations are worse in terms of trust. And this is for that violating agent, I should specify. And then what we also found was that it's the same thing for the team as well. So quick primer on the key here. You can see it's a very colorful graph, but each one denotes a certain agent. And then this black dotted line is one of the ones we're most interested in across these graphs is what's happening to the team right here. And I should specify this is trust in the team, not like literal team level trust yet. But that was one you can see here, like it also affects the team as well. And related to the timing, we also did an exploratory analysis. This is one of our official hypotheses or research questions, but we figured since we have the data, we should take a look at this. Is we're kind of curious what the shape of restoration looked like. And so since we have a condition where only one violation happens early on, and you have so much time after that, or it doesn't, we were curious. And so we found like statistical support and evidence for the fact that it's actually asymptotic. So I think we heard before that like trust only goes up to a certain point and kind of plateaus at some point, and this kind of ceiling effect. Same thing with the development of trust, but we had found here that after it violates and it recovers, it kind of just begins to flatline. So this slope right here is significantly different from this slope. So, and then in terms of the spacing, so again, this is about how far apart they are. We've found an interesting effect that really only affects trust in the team and not in the individual agents. So for all these, we had one ground vehicle violate the first time, and you had the other ground vehicle violate the second time here. And of course, it makes sense that after that same one violates, that trust in that agent would dip. So if the pink one violates, the pink line goes down, yellow line goes down. That makes a lot of sense here. But if you look at the team level one, this little dotted line, nothing really happens for this one as much. Here but in these two, the medium to large spacing, you can see that there is a decline after the yellow one violates right here in the team. So that was an interesting one that like further apart spacing does affect trust in the team. And so our kind of thought behind that is it might kind of be like this, like, wait, similar to the timing one, like things were going well, and now two agents messed up And now like I'm not really sure. I have to keep an eye out because I thought I could just leave them alone. So versus here, like if it happens twice, it's like, all right, well, now I kind of know I can calibrate my trust and I know what to expect. So versus these are a bit more unexpected is our theory. So these two are significantly different in terms of slope from this small spacing one. And then lastly, in terms of the whodunit type of question, in terms of who violate, this one was a very particularly interesting one. So first, it makes a lot of sense here that whichever agent violates, trust in that one will decrease at that time. So again, after the yellow one violates, this yellow dotted line, the yellow line dips, same with the green, same with the blue. What's curious though with this one is if you take a look at the ones who did not violate in these other conditions, so the blue and the green for this one, they didn't violate, right? And in the team, it stays roughly just unaffected for the most part. Same thing in this condition here, the pink and the green one violate. So the yellow and the blue line are relatively unaffected, same with the team's dotted line. But then for some odd reason, in this last condition here, where you have a different type of agent on the different sub-team. So this one was two of the same types of agent. This was two members on the same sub-team, right, on the same sector. This one where you have like this orthogonal like difference here, you'll notice that all of them got impacted and every single line goes down at this part. The two agents that didn't violate, and as well as the team. And so this brought up a really interesting discussion within our team as to why it was only this particular condition. And I think this graphic displays it better. So the V tells you which violator it is and whether it's the first or second one. And then the little circle right here that you see tells you whose trust was affected after the second violation. So in this first condition, for example, the yellow one violates, only the yellow one got lost trust here, right? This one, green one violated, only the green one lost trust here. This one, the blue one violated, and the blue one lost trust, but so did the yellow and the green one. And so our kind of working theory at the moment that we're looking to our thought might be because of the idea that it's a double whammy effectively. So when you have like a different member of a different team, it kind of makes you wonder about the entire team's ability versus this, you might just be containing your trust to like, okay, maybe it's just the ground vehicles in general, or this one, maybe it's just the drones, or maybe it's just this one sub team on sector one. But this one makes you wonder like if this drone on the different team, like two of my teams are compromised now because you have one member on Rocky on this team, you have Eagle on this team. But then I also had a ground vehicle and a drone. So now I can't trust my sub teams or my agents. And so maybe the whole team's compromised. That's kind of our working theory at the moment. But we found that to be very interesting that only when you have that orthogonal, that different team, that trust in the team and trust in each agent was affected. So unfortunately, we don't have anything in terms of the unobtrusive measurement yet. That's a very complex data set to work through. So we're still navigating and cleaning that up. But those are the results. I think I just perfectly hit the timing there. So yeah, I'd love to have dialogue with you guys, hear your questions, talk to you about anything you'd love to hear more about.
Yeah, and everyone or anyone with a question, feel free to put that in the Q&A. And Daniel, I don't know if you have a preference if I can read it off, if you can see it easily. But yeah, questions are open.
Yeah, I'll pull up the chat so I can see. Yeah, so we do have several publications. I should include the list formally. So we had 9 conference presentations from this. We're actively in the middle of an R&R for our theoretical paper right now. And then, so since I graduated, I'm not part of the year 3 effort, but I know they're also working on a publication at the moment for the year 2 results at the moment. But if you'd like, I can send the full list of the citations and attach as many PDFs as I can. I'll have to get my team's members approval first, but I'm sure it'll be fine. Commercial EEG sensors. I think when we were thinking about EEGs, so one of the things we thought about first, because we were like, maybe this is cheaper than, so that suite, it was from Shimmer, was the company that we got it from. It was a pretty expensive set, to be honest with you. So we actually, before we decided to do that, we had looked into just basic, like, Apple Watches, just again, off the shelf material. What we found though, the issue was there was like a certain latency with it too. So I think in terms of like regular daily use, like that couple of like whatever seconds off doesn't really affect like measurement. But in this case, since we wanted to be able to dial it down very specifically, and also from the physio data research that we had found, like it changes within like microseconds or milliseconds or something like that, fractions of a second. And so seconds delay may not affect like commercial use because you're just tracking general metrics on the whole and trends. You don't necessarily need to know at like exactly 12:59 and 42 seconds that like this changed. But for our purposes, we did. So I think we steered away from it for that reason, is because of like just how quickly and how dynamically it changes. Oh, good point.
Well, if we have a brief pause in the questions, I have a sort of more self-interested question about the task you used.
Yeah.
I was first of all wondering if it was developed beforehand, how much you had to put into tailoring it to your specific measurement needs, especially the additional of the AI computer operated players.
Yeah. So I'll go back to the method section. You're talking about like the test bed, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, this we actually built from the ground. Well, we didn't. we had a funding, and as part of our proposal and our request, we worked with a lab called the Gaming Research Integration Learning Lab, and they're nested underneath the Air Force Research Laboratory. But they basically just literally make games and like simulations for people from the ground up. And so we worked with them. We basically worked hand in hand, and one of my co-leads, her whole entire subcontract was basically just to help get this up and running. So this is actually built from the ground up specifically for us. And so all the agents, like the task paradigm, the function, all that type of stuff, that was built from the ground up for this study in particular. So that we could study these exact 4 agents nested in these certain teams, all that. So, and then I think one thing I didn't mention actually, because I wasn't sure if I would have time, this is a bit of a Wizard of Oz methodology here. And so just to clarify, the Wizard of Oz is kind of this idea, like you tell them it's an agent and it looks like an agent, but it's not actually an agent. So some of the ways that typically is done is when you have like a human that's actually controlling it behind the scenes and you're telling them it's an AI. But in our case, we didn't actually even have an AI. We kind of pseudo, like it looked like we did because of like this chat box that you can see where like it looks like they're doing stuff, numbers are populating, so effectively perceptually it looks like they're working with it, but they actually don't ever see the agent itself. And whenever you call them, there's like a black screen. Let me see what's in the video, but there's like a black screen that plays and it says like, this agent's coming to help you right now. I think it might be over here if it is. Okay, I might not have had it in this one, but anyways, we did Wizard of Oz it, so we didn't really develop an AI for this test bed, I will say.
Well, yeah, I mean, still, yeah, looks like and from what I know from my own experience, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it was it was a lot of coordination, it was a lot of effort. Okay, here you said physiological measures show highly dynamic trust. Were you introducing a commercial, well-known physiological instrument for the participants? What if lab-based built own physiological instrument was used in the study? What would it be like based on your experience? What if lab-based? Oh, are you asking like if you were to build your own physiological instrument, what would it be like? I'll answer the first part while you clarify that part. But it wasn't a commercial one, so they didn't know what it was. Part of like our procedure was we actually had to tell them and like show them and walk them through all that stuff. Because let me go back to the picture there. It is a little bit intimidating looking, to be honest with you, when you first work with it here. There's a lot of wires and like things being strapped to you, and like you do have to put on this little sticky gel here, and this is the part that actually helps them with the ECG data, the heart rate stuff. So that effect is like this little gel, that adhesive that basically senses the conductance better. So you have one on your wrist to get where your pulse, basically where it's based on pulse points for the most part, where you place those ones. But we had to walk them through everything, since it wasn't a commercial one. But if I'm understanding your second one about like if you were to build your own lab-based one, what it would be like, I don't have a lot of like experience in terms of the development of like the hardware and software, but I will say and speak to at least what we were able to look at in terms of the data interface, some things that I think are important considerations to answer that question. So again, we were looking at the granularity. One qualm that we did have was with this, it was not the easiest to scale it, and we wish there was a way to standardize data. And that's just something important in general when you're working with physiological data. For anyone who hasn't done that and wants to, you can't interpret and compare two people's directly. You have to standardize the units because people have different like resting heart rates, people have different just natural rhythms to their body. So one, it was difficult because when we went from participant to participant, the numbers were completely like all over. So like graphs might look similar or different, or like some of the people like had such a stable heart rate that they barely changed. That one person almost looked like they were flatlining at one point. So we thought there was an issue with their equipment, and we looked at it and we're like, no, it's working. We had to pause and ask them to like quickly do jumping jacks to make sure it actually up. So anyways, in terms of like the software side of it, I will say like it would be nice to have like focusing on like, again, the type of data you need. If I had to say any advice in terms of like if you were to like, or if you were able to build something custom in terms of the measurement design, thinking a lot about the data output and what you want it to look like, the more like the UI side, because it was very difficult to navigate like their native software. So we actually ended up having to hire a couple SMEs to help subcontract out to help us understand how to clean the data, all that type of stuff. So follow-up question, did you help the participants walk through how their raw physiological data was processed, including? Yes, so it's part of the IRB consent form, but also during this part in our little experiment script, we did specifically say like, for example, like these two things that go on your finger are called GSR nodes. And so what they do is they take your sweat skin response. They could see this output actually right here on the experimenter screen when they were looking at it as well. So we show them, for example, this is the type of data that will be received here. What we're going to do with this later is we're going to, clean it. We're going to go through a process to help standardize that data. And then after that, we're going to aggregate like data based on like certain metrics that we pull out from yours. So for example, like something I would tell a participant was like, see these little spikes and stuff like that, we might count them, for example, and attach that to your data point. And so say like you have like your heart rate like variability was like X, right? Or the number of spikes you had was X, and that would be like your data point. And then we average that, or we look for trends along that with others. So that's kind of like what we tell them in terms of like what they're getting into and how it's being used. Yeah. Thank you, sir. I also greatly appreciate the complexity and effort going into and refining, doing research on these test beds and using such multimodal data. Separately, what did you end up having as your most preferred trust measures of those you compared and used? That's a really good question. So we're still a little bit in the weeds of the physio data. This data was, so for context, I think it's 5 hertz, which means it produces 5 data points every second. And over an hour, I can't do the math off the top of my head. It's thousands upon thousands of rows, like tens of thousands of rows of data. So it's a little bit difficult. So we've been using a lot more of like machine learning to help identify and be like, just distill this, like basically find the points and change for us. So we're not 100% sure yet. We haven't actually like validated the physio data to know that. In terms of like overall, so the single item measures were actually, I think, in terms of like overall, like what data we were able to infer and use for analyses, and in terms of like the effort involved, was our most effective one so far. The behavioral stuff was difficult. We suspect that with the behavioral stuff, there's so much underlying like thoughts that could be happening. Some of it could just be task-based at the moment, that we figure that one has to be like paired with something, some sort of like battery or composite measure But to answer your question, I would say like the single item trust measures for our sake and what we were studying were the most useful. So it was easy. It still gave us like data over time. It does, lack some of the granularity that we wanted to capture specifically in terms of like those trust violation moments and how they react. But I think it still gave us the gist of it too, because the way we had designed it, since we have it every 10 minutes, is they always have a trust survey immediately following a violation, no matter what condition they're in. So because of that, I think the single item measures were the most useful, or our preferred ones. So that said, we're still looking at like overall composites and batteries at least. So like if we were to triangulate and say like this score dips based on the single item survey, and we observed an increase in these behaviors and their physiological data had this trend, that might be like the most accurate way to like, infer that a specific phenomenon is happening, especially for like the spillover type stuff. So again, we were kind of interested in the idea of like, if ground agent 1 violates trust, what happens to like, ground agent 2? So with the unobtrusive measure stuff, like that might be where we get the most value, like especially in like the field down the line. That might be one area that we're thinking like those composites might be able to help you triangulate and more validly infer that like a change in like another agent is happening. So it is difficult to. The other thing I will mention about all this is, again, with the physiological data, the hard point about that is it gives you the time, but it drops so much contextual information, right? So like, sure, someone's heart changed, and like, but you can't tie that to a certain agent, for example, right? I can't say like his heart rate dropped because agent 1 did this or because agent 2 did that. So again, that's the overall trend that we're moving towards, like composites and like, some type of battery of measures, which again complicates the whole analysis system, and hence why we're still working on it. But yeah, that's the other thing I'd share.
I guess I have another question in the last few minutes. Just wondering how you think this compares to, if a human had done these, do you think it would spread, like violated trust in these ways? Think it would spread quicker based on your research and the literature, as well as what you saw between people in your experiment?
Yeah, no, I love that you brought that, because again, one area that we were very intentional about is like we don't want to just basically assume like this is just human teams and just run a human team study, but with agents. That wouldn't make the most sense. So we were that was always like our make sure we're grounding it back into the human agent specifically. And so as part of that, this is where I think having the multidisciplinary team helped a lot, and having like Dr. Carroll's Atlas Lab really helped us inform like thoughts. And so one area or framework that we pulled from is something called Fitz list. And it's called like, the acronym is like HABA and MABA. It's like humans are better at, machines are better at. And so in general, like this list just says like, it's kind of like it's not a real, like a hard validated framework, but it's just like a rule of thumb, like you should have humans do this, machines do this. But it has been used relatedly to study the differences in like attitudes and like cognitions and behaviors that people have towards humans versus agents, right? So one area where that specifically translates to trust really well, to answer your question, is in terms of expectations we have of the agents. We very much, when you think of like a machine, you think like computer, like they should be able to do math like instantaneously. They should have like the ability to do lots of like mechanical tasks super accurately and en masse and quickly, right? And so in terms of like that kind of translates like trust and like competency. So like if you're programmed to do something, you should be doing it right? So if you have like a physical malfunction or whatever, like I don't expect you to do that. You would always expect a human to mess up, to do things. We just don't expect people to be perfect. And so because of that, I think it's like, that's kind of where like that trust violation, the changes differ, is if a human messes up this thing, it's like, oh, well, you just like made a mistake. Anyone could have done that. The agent makes a mistake. It's like, you have sensors, like you're programmed to do this. Could you not do your one job type attitude? And so I think that's one area that I would probably see the biggest difference, is like the size of the drop there. We were curious, like if you did this and you compared to humans, that there might be more of like the spillover and spread type stuff. That was where we were finding less, because we only found it in that one condition, versus we suspect there's a lot more subgrouping that happens in real human, relationships and teams.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And several other thoughts, but I'll perhaps follow up with you after open up these last 5 minutes, 4 minutes, get your questions in. Yeah, otherwise, I think unless someone, oh, here we go.
Good question. So, any psychological factors such as stress can also affect the physio data, specifically in the disaster recovery. Did you find any correlations there? Really, really good point there. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of things that can affect the physio data, as we found out from our SME. Like there's an entire process for cleaning data, but more directly, like participant, like individual, like difference related there. One thing we had to do in our pre-survey is basically like we did do a lot of other like propensity type measures. So like propensity for like trust. One of the things we did measures, what it was called, it was some type of stress index or like propensity for stress type index. We did that. We did like other general like mental like cognitive like measures. I'm forgetting like the full list. It was a very the pre-survey alone takes like 15-20 minutes to do. But in terms of like we did try to control for a lot of them, and so we did like specific tests to see like which ones, because we also do believe in like be intentional about your controls before running it as a confirmed control for your final analyses. I don't think we did find any like major ones there slash yeah, I don't think we found any major correlations that warranted using that. But also I will say, to your point there, I think we're also in like a complex space with the physio data where we have to just understand how to do the basic analyses first before we can run accounting for other covariates and other influencing factors. But from what I remember us doing, I don't remember us finding any like significant correlations or significant predictors that would, other than propensity to trust, I think was the only main one, which makes sense. So, but whenever we ran our overall like correlations. But yeah, we also accounted for like caffeine intake right before they did it, medication. We basically just like looked up like things that affect heart rate and things that affect sweat, and then we just pulled out a giant list and just asked them all of it. Yeah, no, I would love that. So my contact information, and Josh, you can spread my contact information happily, and then I'm happy to share the slide deck with you guys as well. And then if you have questions or you'd love to look more into like my faculties, the PIs, like research from their current portfolios and endeavors, you can do that as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Send out your information. I'm also just going to use that sort of transition to send out our OTTRS link. Everyone, thank you for coming, and thank you so much for this amazing talk. I think it really sets us up perfectly for semester and everything. But here is our website to everybody. We've got more speakers coming in through May. We do have another minute. If you're drafting a question for Daniel, absolutely feel free to keep on that. Otherwise, yeah. Thank you, everybody.